In 2026, the world was shocked by images of thousands of people crossing the borders of the Spanish cities of Ceuta and Melilla. But what few people realize is that, interestingly, the Islamic invasion of the Iberian Peninsula actually began right there in 711. And what's more, according to legend, it was motivated by a woman. But after all, why are these cities located in North Africa Spanish and not Moroccan? What made Portugal try so hard to conquer one of them in the Middle Ages? How are they connected to the Reconquista? And what hidden symbolic weight do they really carry? In today's video, we're going to cross the Strait of Gibraltar in both directions to understand why Ceuta and Melilla are, to this day, parts of Spain in Africa. But before we start the video, if you like our content, become a member of our channel right now. That way, you'll have access to our group and exclusive content, including live classes to dive even deeper into the hidden side of history. To understand why there are Spanish cities in North Africa, we need to go back to the time when Spain itself was completely dominated by Islam. At the beginning of the 8th century, Ceuta was governed by a count named Julian. The city was on the African side of the strait, right across from the peninsula, and it was the key city that opened or closed the passage between the two continents. And, according to legend, it was this Count Julian who handed over this key to the Muslims. That's because Julian supposedly took his daughter Florinda to live at the court of the Visigothic king Rodrigo in the city of Toledo. And there, a great scandal supposedly happened. According to the Moorish chronicles, the young Florinda was allegedly raped by King Rodrigo. According to the Leonese chronicles, she had a sexual relationship with the king, but he had no intention of marrying her. In any case, this led Florinda to quickly write to her father, saying that the king had dishonored her. And, enraged, Julian took revenge by opening the gates of Ceuta so that Tariq's Islamic troops could enter. Thus, in 711, the army commanded by the Berber Tariq crossed the strait, departing precisely from the vicinity of Ceuta, and landed on the rock that still bears his name to this day, Gibraltar, which means the mountain of Tariq. In the Battle of Guadalete, Rodrigo was betrayed by his own nobles and defeated. And so in just a few years, almost the entire Iberian Peninsula fell under Muslim rule. In this way, would Ceuta carry this symbolic meaning? Would it be the place where the invasion began? The place that, according to legends, opened its gates to the Islamic conquest. And so, with the mindset of being successors to the Visigoths, did conquering this stronghold mean a lot? And that's how we get to 1415. 700 years after 711, King Dom Juan I, the first of a new dynasty, needed a great achievement to leave his mark on history. His 4 sons needed to be knighted, and instead of a tournament, they chose a real battle, a conquest beyond the sea. And the conquest would be precisely the conquest of the city of Ceuta, that city famous for the chronicles of Julian. So, on August 21st, 1415, a huge Portuguese fleet with more than 200 ships and tens of thousands of men landed in the city. And within a matter of hours, the city of Ceuta fell. So for the first time since 711, the African gateway of the strait returned to Christian hands. And not just to anyone, but to an Iberian kingdom, crossing in the opposite direction of the Moors. Ceuta, in this way, was the first Portuguese possession in Africa and is considered the starting point of the Age of Discovery. From there, Portugal would begin to sail down the African coast, round the Cape of Good Hope, and finally reach India. And this city was so symbolic that King Dom Juan I died bearing the title of King of Portugal and Lord of Ceuta, the man who reconquered for Christendom the starting point of the Moorish conquest. And the symbolic relevance of the conquest of Ceuta was so great that when the Moroccans captured Prince Dom Fernando in a failed expedition to Tangier and demanded the surrender of Ceuta. In exchange for his freedom, the Portuguese preferred to keep the city, with the young Fernando dying in prison. But economically, the conquest of Ceuta was a terrible deal. Surrounded by hostile Muslim territories, Ceuta became a permanent military stronghold, extremely expensive to maintain and difficult to defend. The city depended entirely on supplies coming from Portugal, and it was not self-sufficient. In addition, it was constantly attacked and besieged by the Moors. And whenever that happened, thousands of Portuguese lives were wasted on those walls. But then a question arises. Why were the Iberian kingdoms so obsessed with the other side of the sea? Was it just because of the legend of Julian? First, it's necessary to really understand the Reconquest mentality of that time. For the Iberians, the Reconquest didn't end in Europe. That's because North Africa had already been Christian. In other words, for the Iberians, crossing the strait and retaking those lands wouldn't be invading foreign territory, but rather continuing the same crusade on the other side of the Mediterranean. It would be restoring to Christendom the old bishoprics and dioceses that existed before the Moorish conquest. And, as we've already seen here on the channel, there were even plans by Iberian kingdoms that involved a crusade to the Holy Land, first taking control of several strongholds in North Africa. In fact, Portugal and Castile, through the Treaty of Alcáçovas, even divided North Africa, with Spain being allowed to conquer the African coast, except for the Kingdom of Fez in Morocco, which would be Portugal's right of conquest. And so, in 1497, just 5 years after the fall of Granada, a Castilian expedition, commanded by Pedro de Estopiñán and serving the powerful House of Medina, Sidonia, lands in North Africa and takes the city of Melilla. The curious thing is that Melilla was taken almost without a fight. The city was practically abandoned and in ruins. And the Castilians simply occupied the city, repaired the walls, and stationed a garrison there. If Ceuta was poor, a Portuguese gateway in Africa, Melilla became the Castilian gateway. The strategy was to control key fortified points along the coast. And in North Africa, these fortified points became known as Presidios. These Presidios were called that not in the sense of being a prison, but as a stronghold of an advanced military garrison in hostile territory. Ceuta and Melilla were exactly that. And these Presidios would soon gain a vital role in containing piracy. Throughout the 16th and 17th centuries, the Western Mediterranean became the stage for a silent and brutal war. From North African cities like Algiers, Tunis, Salé, and Tripoli, the feared Berber corsairs set out, many of them connected to the Ottoman Empire. These pirates didn't just attack ships, they also raided entire coastal communities in Portugal, Spain, and Italy, kidnapping people to sell as slaves, mainly in Algiers. It is estimated that hundreds of thousands of Europeans were taken captive in North Africa over those centuries. And perhaps the most famous case is that of the writer Miguel de Cervantes, the author of Don Quixote, who spent 5 years held captive in Algiers before being rescued. And that's where Ceuta and Melilla show their true value. Set on the African coast, they served as forward ramparts for Portugal and Spain. They were eyes and ears in enemy territory. They were bases to watch over the strait, house troops, and make life difficult for the corsairs. And it was this defensive function, even more than commercial profit, that justified keeping, decade after decade, century after century, extremely expensive garrisons in cities surrounded on all sides. Thus, while other Iberian outposts in North Africa were lost or abandoned over time, Ceuta and Melilla held out. And they held out so well that they lasted for several centuries. Which brings us to the central question of this video. If Ceuta was conquered by Portugal and Morocco, became independent in 1956, then why do these two cities remain Spanish to this day? The answer lies in the Iberian Union. Between 1580 and 1640, Portugal and Spain were united under the same crown. And during that period, Ceuta continued to be administered by the Portuguese, but under a king who was at the same time King of Portugal and Spain. However, in 1640, Portugal rebelled and restored its independence, proclaiming the Duke of Braganza as the new king, Dom João IV. The entire Portuguese Empire from Brazil to India began to recognize the new king. The entire empire except for one city. Ceuta refused to recognize the Portuguese king and chose to remain loyal to the Castilian crown. And that choice was made official in 1668 in the Treaty of Lisbon. In that treaty, Portugal recognizes Ceuta as Spanish territory. And that's where this irony reaches its peak. Ceuta is not Spanish because Spain conquered it. It is Spanish because, at the moment when it had to choose between Lisbon or Madrid, it chose Madrid. But this city is so Portuguese that its flag is similar to the flag of Lisbon, and it even has the coat of arms of Portugal on it. However, centuries have passed. Morocco, which for a long time was fragmented or under colonial rule, became independent in the 20th century. However, Ceuta and Melilla, which had never been part of the modern Moroccan state, remained with Spain. In 1995, the two cities were elevated to the status of autonomous cities, with a high degree of self-government very similar to regions like Catalonia or the Basque Country. And today they are the only land border between the European Union and the African continent. And precisely because of that, they became a flashpoint in migration crises, with thousands of people trying to cross their fences in an attempt to reach Europe. Morocco, in turn, never accepted this situation. The kingdom claims the two cities, calling them colonial outposts and wanting to integrate them into its territory. But Spain continues to hold Ceuta and Melilla and reaffirms that they are Spanish. And this is where we reach the big takeaway of this story. Ceuta and Melilla are not some colonial whim lost on the map. They are, in fact, the last living and frozen fragments of the Reconquista. And the most impressive thing is the antiquity of this presence. Melilla has been Spanish since 1497. In other words, Spain has controlled Melilla for longer than it controlled Mexico or Peru, which would only be conquered in 1520 and 1530. And Ceuta has been an Iberian city since 1415 in the Middle Ages, almost 100 years before Portugal reached India or discovered Brazil. And while the entire Spanish America became independent and the immense Portuguese empire in the east collapsed, these two small cities stubbornly remain European. So, those who know the history of the Iberian Peninsula well understand why the images from 2026 are so frightening. Because they smack of history repeating itself, and because they touch on a wound that has dragged on for centuries, and that remains deeply marked in the history of these two cities. And you? Did you know Ceuta had been conquered by Portugal rather than Spain? Did you know these cities were so old? What surprised you the most? So go ahead and leave a like and a comment right now to support our work, and take the opportunity to become a channel member right now. That way, you'll be able to dive deeper and learn even more about the fascinating Iberian history.